Good morning, everyone. My name is David Hedin. I'm the Ecology Section Manager and Ecology Section Manager at the Georgia Department of Transportation. I'm here to speak with you today about perennial stream culvert conditions, which we are working to address in response to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Clean Water Act Section 404 requirements. This is an issue that's been around for quite some time, my entire career, basically, which began in 2005. This is an issue that has been addressed various ways over the years. We are today presenting the best practices that we currently have, and we are going to discuss especially what can be expected in terms of the roles of the ecologist as well as the designer, especially. Project managers, this is good information for you. Other members of project teams and other contributing engineers to these efforts are also, this should be informative for y'all as well. So thanks for tuning in today. Before I get started, wanted to mention that it's myself and Sam Woods will be the presenters today. We do have a moderator, Christina Schmidt of Atkins, who has done a ton of heavy lifting on this subject in the past year and a half. And to start off with some housekeeping for this virtual house we're in, anonymous attendees will not show up on the engagement report. So if you join via the Teams application, we will have your name. If you join via the web, please add your name to the chat so that we can make record of that. Everyone's microphones are muted, except mine. And questions will be moderated by Christina Schmidt, and you can put your questions into the Q&A box. After each presentation, Sam and I, well, first myself and then Sam will field questions. We're going to divide this where I'm going to present first, then Sam. We will have a break in the middle. And this session is being recorded. And if you are seeking continuing education units or professional development hours, please submit your requests no later than July 30th to Gail. And break time today might be an ideal time to draft that email. All right, so the goals as stated for today's session are the following. We want folks to understand the regional conditions as it pertains to perennial stream culverts. We want to make sure folks understand as best anyone can the definition or the concepts of bankful width and ways to identify that all important metric. Bankful width, that's a new phrase for you, get used to it. Project delivery implications for projects with perennial stream culverts. This is really kind of a summary point to make about project delivery, but what's interesting about our presentation is that between myself and Sam, representing the Office of Environmental Services and the Office of Roadway Design, we have roles that kind of hand things back and forth. And so initially, when ecologists are doing resource ID, we will be the ones to identify these perennial streams. We'll be the ones to try and make the first a field estimate of the bankful width, hopefully an accurate measurement of bankful width. We're also going to talk though about what Sam's folks, the designers, can do as well as ecologists can do in advance of that field work and then after that field work. So project delivery implications begin with when we're doing these surveys for resource ID, and it carries all the way through permit application, which is just prior to let. If y'all, well, anyhow, so in terms of project delivery, where the rubber meets the road is generally at let, and if we cannot obtain permit authorization, we cannot certify the project for let. So that's what makes this such an important topic for us to all know about. Sam is going to dig further into how to design a culvert that complies with these regional conditions and also how to address perennial stream culvert requirements, including diagrams for the Section 404 permit application. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to give my portion of the presentation here. I've spoken at two previous summer seminar series here at the ACEC Summer Series. Thanks for attending if you've been to any of those. If you have, you'll recognize this picture. One of my favorites, it's my favorite place. It's Earth. Earth, as I've mentioned before, covered in water, just covered. Granted, there's some deserts out there. There's some parts that don't have water on them. Those have water over them. The atmosphere contains water as well. And so we do have to consider water throughout our design process, even though it's not necessarily part of our site survey in terms of what we've gathered to give to engineers. They're focused on a certain set of parameters as it pertains to water. We can add this to that set of that list of parameters that we need to get right. So when a designer is considering what culvert to put in a given location, it's very important that they be cognizant of things we've talked about before during the summer series, as well as what we're going to talk about today, which speaks to the stability of stream systems. And that's really the goal of what we'll be digging into. So all this water that, if you follow the water cycle, the water evaporates, goes into the air, becomes clouds, then it rains when it condenses or snows, comes back down to the surface of the earth. Some of it goes into the earth, becomes groundwater. Some of it flows over top of our landforms. Those are surface waters, all of that heading back to the lowest elevation because of gravity. And on this journey that water is taking, it winds up doing some very dynamic things. As you've heard, it's a shapeshifter already. It's going from liquid up to a suspended state in the atmosphere and then back down. It's quite remarkable what all water can do. Someone mentioned after the last presentation, I had a quote, "We're all chock full of water." I'll stand by that quote. In terms of what we're trying to accomplish with Bankful width and culverts on perennial streams is trying to meet the water where it's at, so to speak, which is to say the water is working in conjunction with the channel that it is in when we're dealing with perennial streams to maintain a given channel morphology. That channel is best maintained supposedly through approximately a 1.5 year storm event. Why is that the ideal event? That's something I may not be able to explain very well, but I can say that the theory behind this is that every 1.5 years or so, the amount of rain we get in a substantial storm in that period is the best storm to form the channel. And so it's not blowing out the channel. It's not sort of modifying the channel in major and unsustainable ways, but rather it is sort of forming the channel to the average. These are tough terms for a gray concept like I'm describing, but basically it is seeking an equilibrium of averages within that channel as the water flows through it. So here on Earth, we've got water all over the place, but you know where we got a lot of water? Parts of North America, and especially southeastern North America. So here's a couple ecoregion maps for folks. These maps are, a broad conception of not only the underlying geology of the continent and the state, but also of the habitat over top of that geology. Water plays an important part. As you can see on the Georgia map here, we are covered in waters. The fact that water is all coursing over our state on its way back to oceans, either the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico, which is, an extension of the Atlantic. That water on its way has hundreds of miles to go. So even though it's contained entirely within the state of Georgia, the Altamaha River and the extensions of it, which are the Ocmulgee and the Oconee going furthest upstream, if you put your canoe in at the very upstream end of that and got to the Atlantic Ocean in your canoe, you would have traveled nearly 400 miles. This is not a 400-mile tall state. Sinuosity. Water does not travel in straight lines. That's another key to this. When we put water in straight lines, such as in a box culvert, we are greatly modifying what water naturally does when it interacts with other more natural substrates. So again, I'm introducing these broad themes so that y'all can understand what the goals are of our data collection and how we're going to present that data to the U.S. Army Corps when dealing with box culverts on perennial streams. Here's one now. So if you're a fish trying to go upstream, this box culvert might present some challenges to you. And so at a higher flow after a storm, sure, maybe the water can creep up and get over the lip of this culvert apron. But in general, this culvert represents a complete impasse to aquatic life to the opposite side of the road. Another thing about this culvert is it doesn't have natural substrate on the bottom of it. Natural substrate is obviously something that creates habitat within a stream system. It creates dynamic flows within, eddies and so on for the water. There's shelter for critters within that substrate. If you have what's essentially a sidewalk paved on the bottom of your culvert, you don't provide any of those things for this aquatic life that formerly was using, presumably, that reach of stream. So in order to try and be thoughtful about maintaining aquatic connectivity while building roads, we need to not just think about how we're getting humans over top of the stream, not just how we're getting traffic over top of the stream, and not just how we're getting water off our roads to keep them safe. All those things are important. Those are all goals of the Georgia Department of Transportation. Another goal ought to be maintaining aquatic connectivity. This is no small thing, because you can't just put your fish on a leash and walk across the street with it. I will say that, these culvert lips and so on, going out there over time, it can be difficult to conceive of a culvert you're going to put in place that will be there for, say, 50 plus years, while this dynamic system is operating around it, upstream of it and downstream of it. It is not necessarily a surprise that these changes in elevation occur over time due to scour and other erosional forces. What we can do is anticipate that, and that's why embedding culverts is so much better than in theory anyhow. And it makes sense to me that when we embed the culvert, when we allow natural substrate to colonize the bottom of that culvert, we're providing all kinds of benefits to that stream system, as well as the connectivity for aquatic life. All right, so that is the broad view of why this matters. That's the broad view of why the U.S. Army Corps is requiring GDOT to be thoughtful about our approach to this. And at this stage, I want to turn to the U.S. Army Corps' regional conditions on this subject. I will say at the outset here that regional conditions there's two things. There's regional conditions and regional permits. I've gone over this once before in a previous summer seminar series, but to reiterate, we have nationwide permits and regional permits, both of which have culvert considerations, and the latest version of those to come out is associated with the 2021 nationwide permits. What is confusing, and I'll try and explain clearly here, is right now we have essentially three different sets of conditions that could apply to these things, which is to say the 2021 nationwide permit regional conditions. We also have an existing set of 2017 nationwide permit regional conditions, which have not yet expired. These new ones didn't replace all the old ones. And then finally, we have a set of regional permits issued by the Savannah District, and those also contain requirements related to perennial stream culverts. So to try and cut to the chase about what is the right resource to look at, let's all turn our mindset to the culvert conditions in the 2021 nationwide regional conditions. So as I mentioned, this issue's been around quite a long time, my entire career basically. And in terms of, what GDOT projects have been permitted in that time, we have presented culvert passage diagrams, so to speak, to the Corps at times in history, although perhaps not consistently so. And most recently with this effort to roll out the 2021 nationwide permits, the Corps undertook a rejuvenated effort to ensure that these conditions are being met by their applicants, which includes the Georgia Department of Transportation. So as we move forward with this, I want to let folks know that, this isn't brand new. This may well not be the first time you've heard about this, and we'll talk about some of the history within GDOT in terms of how we've addressed this in the past. Again, this presentation is intended to be a pivot point to the best practices moving forward. All right. As I mentioned before, these revisions were actually developed, I haven't gotten deep into this. I should add that in the run up to these 2021 conditions, Georgia DOT and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service both met with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on a few occasions to discuss what exactly was going into these conditions. There were negotiations about what they would include. And in the end, what was published on March 8th, 2021 is what we're planning to go by. The Corps also intends to move forward with the new conditions for all these different types of permits I mentioned. So again, to try and eliminate confusion, although there are 3 sets of conditions on the street, none of which match exactly the other, the newest should be the latest and greatest. So these were conditions were developed collaboratively. They were focused on trying to improve the organization and clarity of the conditions, which also turned back to improving the organization and clarity of our submittals to the Corps. Interesting here that we've separated new and replacement culverts from culvert extensions. The 2021 nationwide permits do not require culvert diagrams for culvert extensions. That's important because the amount of effort that it takes that we're going to talk through this morning to create those diagrams, although it's purposeful and can have value, especially for new and replacement culverts, it's more work than we would want to do for an extension where, in many cases, reconnecting aquatic passage in an existing culvert is impractical, to say it mildly. On occasion, with a multi-barrel culvert, you may be able to retrofit and improve aquatic passage at low flows, but basically, once you've got a box culvert on the landscape, it's hard to wiggle it, so to speak. You can't embed it retroactively, and so our best efforts are those that are moving forward, and we don't want to be backwards looking. I will say that because the old regional permits, 2018, they're still out on the street, and the 2017 nationwide permits, I don't know why I call the regional permits old, by the way. Both of these permits, the general permits, they do not exempt the culvert extensions, but the newest nationwide permit conditions do not require diagrams for culvert extensions. So that's what we're moving forward with. And in the meantime, the Corps, we continue to be in discussion with the Corps about this issue. I will say that, for better or worse, at the end of the day, in black and white, culvert conditions do not require diagrams per the 2021 nationwide regional conditions. We took a deep dive into what's meaningful in these diagrams, and I think that GDOT made several improvements, and we'll talk about those, especially Sam will dig deep into that. And then the Corps is after talking through this, I think what the Corps realized, as well as what GDOT realized, is it's what we learn every time. Starting earlier is better. And so we will talk about today how to deal with projects that have already gone through resource identification phase and may require another field visit in order to get accurate Bankful data. As an ecologist, I can tell you honestly that I've eyeballed a lot of Bankful measurements out there, and in today's world and what we're trying to accomplish here, eyeballing Bankful is no longer acceptable. So a practice that was common to me in my field work it has to change in order for us to meet these conditions. So I want folks to know these are meaningful changes. We did talk with the Corps about making sure that we didn't make this too onerous in terms of the effort involved. And so we will present additional information today on how ecologists can approach accurate Bankful measurements. GDOT guidance is forthcoming on all of this. We do have guidebooks related to permitting available from the Environmental Services, from the Office of Environmental Services, but specific guidance about the new approach to perennial stream culverts is still in development, so please keep an eye out for that. And both in the near term and in the future, implementation is key. The whole goal of all of this from the GDOT perspective, from a project delivery perspective, is making sure that when we apply for a permit, we can get it and get it ideally without delay, which otherwise we risk delaying LETs because our permit applications come shortly before LET certification. Okay, so a few major considerations. I'll reiterate that what I'm talking about here is with regard to diagrams that we're going to move into has to do with only new location culverts and culvert replacements, not extensions. I think I've explained why. So culvert size is the big takeaway because bankful width will drive the decision on how wide the proposed culvert can be in order to still allow for aquatic passage, aquatic organism passage. There are other design requirements for culverts, and we don't mean to overwrite any of those with this. This is an additional consideration for designers to bear in mind, but obviously, you know, dealing with 25-year flood, 50-year flood, making sure that we have a adequate volume, so to speak, to allow these floodwaters to pass is still still the core of what the designer is doing on these projects, but it should take into account moving forward this question of bankful width. So that's another metric to bear in mind. I've talked about culvert embedding and why that's desirable. I will say that for, you know, this happens to show a circular culvert, and in many cases, what we're dealing with in these perennial stream situations are box culverts. In either case, the 20% applies. Culvert slope is important. This didn't change much from the previous iterations, but one additional detail that's been added for clarity is that the goal is to match the existing stream channel slope within 25%. So that's, if that can't be accomplished, a couple of things. One is that we would explain to the Corps why that's, you know, not doable in that given situation. Another important thing to bear in mind is, you know, depending on, even if we can't get within 25%, we could still have a grade that's adequate for aquatic passage. And so while that is the goal, it's not a hard and fast goal that we cannot violate. That would make certain situations unconstructible, I believe. So diagrams are a big deal now, and I'm going to look ahead at what the diagrams are here first, and then we're gonna, you know, to kind of begin with the end in mind, as Sam likes to say. What I want to do here is let you all know what the intent, what the outcome is for these efforts, collaborating between ecology and design, and what is going to be submitted to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, what they require in order to approve these permit applications. So we have plan view. There's an unusual situation down in near the Alabama border, but nonetheless, here's a new culvert under a bridge. You don't see that all the time. And the workup on this was done by Christina Schmidt in the field, who also happens to be our program level expert at this undertaking of improving our culvert condition data collection. And so this was informative for her and for all of us in terms of what she's learned going through these examples, and then going all the way to permanent authorization with the Corps. Plan view, obviously 13 series diagrams is fine. And I will have examples of these others in subsequent slides. We're also going to look at the longitudinal profile. We're not going to look at the examples directly from this project, forgive me, but we do have some examples to show you the existing long pro and the proposed long pro. There's some innovations that Sam will discuss about how to produce that proposed longitudinal profile. The representative cross sections are very helpful. I'll talk more about why those, how important that term representative is. And then cross sections of the proposed inlet and outlet location. So making sure effectively that the stream channel is tying in to the culvert when we're picking up and putting down that stream, that those elevations match ideally. Bearing in mind the 20% embedment, by the way. Okay, so here's an example of the existing longitudinal profile next to a proposed longitudinal profile. In this instance, this is, you know, This is effectively a schematic, and in reality, we'll talk about sort of the complications involved in gathering longitudinal profile data. But suffice it to say, this is what we're getting at, trying to take a sidelong view of the culvert in order to make sure that we are meeting all of those conditions with regard to slope, embedment, and size, particularly width. Now, width is not a dimension we're looking at here on the long pros, but width comes into play when we get to these cross sections. And as you can see, we've got a couple terms here. I want to pause at this moment and just let folks know flood prone and bankful look a lot like some other words. And bankful, in an ideal situation, in a stream system that may have achieved equilibrium for this moment in time, a bankful truly can mean top of bank to top of bank, and it's defined that way in many resources. However, in Georgia, with our erodible soils, with our very changed landscape in the last couple of centuries, we often have streams that are undergoing morphologic change actively. And when that's happening, that bankful is generally not flush with the top of bank. And so I think that over the last, again, over my career, bankful has been a stumbling block for many folks because they simply assume it means what it sounds like it means, which is when the banks are full. That's not what it means. It means, well, we'll get to, I'll give you a real definition so I don't give you a Dave definition now. Otherwise it'll be something like humans are chock full of water. Bankful is chock full of water. Flood prone area is also a bit confusing because it sounds so much like floodplain. Floodplains are real things. You can see one here. The existing ground may well be the floodplain, although with bankful down low, that's the existing ground where it's labeled may be a former floodplain, and now this system is cutting down and reestablishing a new floodplain inside that broader channel. So if that blows your mind, welcome to the joy that is trying to imagine what streams are going to do over time. Our best effort to identify bankful should yield a meaningful width for our culverts. And so turning here to the diagram on the right, you can see that we're trying to find the right size of culvert that will accommodate bankful, but no smaller than bankful. You don't want to overly constrict a stream channel. That does bad things as well. Okay. In terms of conditions that apply to culvert extensions, I do want to be clear about this. These new conditions require that there be an evaluation about the existing structure to determine whether or not it's currently passable. Ideally for GDOT projects, this would happen during resource ID and then lead to a meaningful discussion with design potentially beginning as early as A3M. And that's really what we're focused on here is in the future when we have projects going through resource identification, the ecologist is already on site. The ecologist can get this data more accurately than eyeballing it, which is my traditional approach, which is no longer, adequate. So we want to take advantage of that. I'll also speak to the fact that we have plenty of projects that are beyond resource ID. And in those situations, we'll talk about what you can do to try and make sure you have all the necessary information to create these diagrams and get these permit authorizations. Let's see here. So these culvert, this is a snippet from the regional conditions, and I do encourage folks to read them yourself. There's a lot more to this, but these are the pieces that pertain specifically to the culvert extensions. Again, I want to let folks know that this is something that is in print. Although you can see draft creeping onto this slide at the bottom, these culvert conditions are now in force as an official document from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. What's odd about that, again, is that there are other conditions for other permits that don't match this, and we are trying to confirm with the Corps that moving forward, culvert extensions can and will follow this approach that's on your screen. All right, so you take all these thoughts, all these ideas, all these concepts, you gather all of your data, and what are you going to do with it, and how are you going to gather that data as well? So implementation is the key here, and as I've said, we're reactive on projects that are already out of the gate where resource ID is in our rear view mirror, but we are in the future going to be building that into our surveys from the very beginning of a project. Also reactive in a sense of we have received comments from the Corps over the last 12 to 18 months on these issues consistently. And we've got a good body of practice now built out of the responses to those questions, and that's what we're sharing today. I do want to also say that we're trying to turn to a proactive posture, not only for future projects, but even on ongoing projects, because those are, all on their way to let at this point, and how we're going to gather the data for those is one of the key items we're going to talk about. We're also going to dig further into coordination between ecology and design, talk more about what the internal guidance is that's available and that will become available. And then in terms of permit submittals, I can't say this enough, and the Corps tells us this all the time, tell the story. What I've presented here, in case this isn't something you've thought of before, this is an important piece of our permit applications. And so most ecologists have been through this, exercise of this level of analysis to some extent, but what we are proposing, and because there's no other way to do this besides teamwork, is that the ecologist and the designer collaborate far more than they have in the past, and also that the ecologist use what they hear from the designer to help tell the story of both what's going on at the location in terms of that stream system. How is it, what's its connectivity, what's the substrate like, et cetera, but also working with the designer to figure out what the constraints are, the design constraints, so that story can be told as well. We have had a working group with the U.S. Army Corps, and that has been on, I guess most recently we met July 15th. So just to let folks know, some of the finer points of this we're still in discussion with the Corps about, and so we are both trying to solve this from a programmatic level as well as a project-oriented level, making sure that that GDOT can continue to deliver projects. Okay, so moving ahead, I'll dig into field data collection, coordination with design. We'll talk about ongoing projects and share tips for permit applications for ecologists. Field data collection is, as I said, it can be done carefully or it can be done quickly. And so in terms of how careful we need folks to be, don't glance at the stream these days and say that's about 8 feet and go on. Take the time to walk the reach, take the time to understand what you're dealing with, and take the appropriate instruments and equipment to get accurate measurements. So for new projects, again, resource ID at perennial streams is important. I will mention that not all perennial streams that show up in an environmental survey boundary would require this level of diagrams, but we would still, when there's a perennial stream on a project, it's good to get these Bankful measurements correct. So that part doesn't change from perennial stream to perennial stream, but in terms of what projects we're going to do the full workup for diagrams, what locations require these diagrams for perennial stream culverts, obviously it's only the perennial streams that are going to have culverts on them, and not perennial streams that sort of nick the edge of the environmental survey boundary. So while you're out there, Bankful width and maximum depth at Bankful are the critical data points to get with regard to that. We do also need a GPS point so that we know exactly where this data was gathered from, and photos and documentation and narratives, those kinds of things, can't say enough about while you're on site, do the work while you're there, get all the information you can. It's always frustrating to come back to the office and go, man, I wish I would have written that down. What did I see over there? So hard lesson learned from doing field work there. 1 to 2 representative channel locations per stream. What is representative? Typical is a term that's often used in engineering, and what we're looking for is essentially the stream's typical section. And so a representative cross section of the stream is to be taken not just anywhere. You don't want to go to the deepest pool and take a cross section. No, to identify bankful, which again is created by that 1.5 year flow, or at least best maintained by that 1.5 year flow. To identify that bankful width and max depth at bankful, what we need to do is look for the head of a run or a ripple if possible. These are stream geomorphology terms, but basically you don't want an area that is not flowing. And also there are other aspects of the stream that may not lend themselves to suitable representative channel cross sections. When dealing with existing culverts, photos of the inlet and the outlet are helpful. Another thing that we've not sort of incorporated before, but again, trying to empower everyone involved in this undertaking to add value to it. While you're on site, if you observe that the culvert is in terrible condition, granted, you're not a structural engineer if you're an ecologist, but you may be able to report back that, hey, this one's really tough. Because what we don't want, and this happens even today, is to imagine we're going to move forward with an extension and then find out later it actually needs to be replaced. So again, bringing forth concerns about the structure. If you see any of those concerns, at the very least, and extremely helpful are photos of the existing inlet and outlet, if there is one, and if there's not an existing structure there, which means we're going to do the diagrams, you still want a lot of photos of that reach so that you have them for future reference. Another thing that you can observe on existing culverts is perching. So if you have a perched apron where, as we saw before in a photograph, where the connectivity of the stream is essentially there's a big step in the stream, and that is difficult for aquatic life to move past that step, especially in the upstream direction and especially at low flows. And so if you see disconnectivity, if you will, making note of that is critically important as well. Again, photos and notes ad nauseum, they're really good. Something that is extremely confounding about streams, especially in Georgia, we have a lot of beavers in Georgia, and beavers can turn a stream into a wetland in a matter of weeks or months. It's really impressive what a dam can do. And in that regard, that's a tricky situation for the ecologist. In terms of permitting, we have to make the decision as to whether or not we're permitting a stream impact or a wetland impact. It also has knock-on effects in terms of, well, do we anticipate that beaver activity will be in this location in the future? How might this affect the future hydrology? Look, none of us have that crystal ball, but I do want to introduce that beaver activity is one of the most sort of perplexing issues to solve, because there's kind of an active agent out there working to obscure, if you will, the bankful indicators if they exist at a given location. And perennial streams are fine places for beavers to build dams, and furthermore, bottlenecks such as culverts on perennial streams are really ideal. So, beavers aren't necessarily welcome denizens at our culverts because they're intended to pass water, not to hold it back, but I will say that that's one of these many complicated things in the environment to bear in mind when you're considering these things. Another thing to look at on site and on aerials is impoundments, looking upstream and downstream. Is this stream flowing from one impoundment to the next? If that's the case, the aquatic life passage, although we've had this conversation with the Corps and they still expect to see diagrams, et cetera, for these cases, that, from a practical standpoint, the culvert is likely not the impediment to aquatic passage, but rather the impoundments upstream or downstream. At minimum, you should identify one good location per stream to make sure you get a good representative cross section. But if your stream is highly variable, please get at least 2 cross sections. If your stream covers a lot of survey area, and if you have time, more data is probably better in terms of giving you the confidence that you're not picking the wrong place to take a typical section, to find a representative cross section of the stream. And also it gives you better perspective, more information is better in terms of judging, again, in this field science approach to this, even with a 1/16 of an inch level precision on your measurement, you're measuring a fairly imprecise indicator. And so I do want to say that errors compound and also false precision exists. So bear in mind, do the best you can with data collection, and understand that we aren't getting necessarily engineer level data on this. We're just trying to get an accurate understanding of what a typical cross section is. Okay, so how do you identify these representative channel locations? A riffle or a ripple is a fine place to do it. Again, these are stream geomorphology terms, and in the term with regard to ripple, it's specific to sandbed streams. Forgive me if I mentioned earlier runs. They are not the ideal location, although if you're unable to find a riffle or a ripple in your given area, a run is probably your next best place to look. Measure it away from the influence of the existing culvert. So if you think about the effects of a culvert on one of these stream systems, upstream of the culvert is likely a better place than downstream to try and get a typical section of what this stream is doing naturally. And also further away is probably better than closer, just in general, because it's not as though upstream effects don't occur as a result of culverts within a stream. You're looking for what's stable, typical, and most natural, and you want to avoid pools, bends, and overly wide constricted locations or abnormal sections. Those aren't going to be informative. One other thing that we used to do that we should not do anymore, y'all, giving a range of Bankful. Bankful, again, this theory holds that there is a given point within that channel that is the appropriate width and height for the, what I'm calling effectively the stream typical section. You have to be mindful of picking the numbers, between 4 and 8 feet, or between, 8 and 15 feet, which literally those are the kinds of ranges I would put in. And I was building that off of the understanding of looking at the actual water width the day I was there might vary from 2 feet to 8 feet. And then it might follow that Bankful would be a similar range. No, in fact, Bankful ought to be one measurement. And so please don't, ecologists, when you're identifying a value for Bankful, we're not looking for a range, we are looking for an actual value. And look, if it's complicated and you're unsure, that's good to disclose too. Again, a lot of these systems are very tricky out there in Georgia. We've got a lot of change going on in our streams, a lot of active change in elevation of the stream channel. So I've mentioned this, survey additional locations if needed as time allows. So here you go. So how are you going to identify Bankful? We've been talking about this the whole day. Well, what the heck am I even talking about? So I'll draw your attention to these yellow dashed lines. This is an example that illustrates, a few things. This shows, what a stream channel might look like and how you might go about gathering the data in terms of, you can see the tape measure spread across there at approximately a level elevation. And so using that tape measure and a rod, it's fairly simple to gather some basic information about this cross section. We are not asking that ecologists generate a cross-sectional diagram for each of these locations. I'm not saying don't do it. That's fine if it's helpful. And I'll tell you, I find it helpful. However, we are not looking to create additional deliverables for this exercise, but we are looking to get the best data we can. And that's why these dashed yellow lines can help folks understand what it is we're trying to key in on when we're in the field. So here we are looking at two different streams. And again, that the definition that speaks to flooding doesn't sound exactly right here, because this bankful is slightly lower than the elevation of that terrace around it, or that flat area around it, in both these cases. So this does look correct to my eye, certainly. From afar, this looks like the right bankful elevation, the right bankful width, if we were gonna, and these are real projects, so this is what was used in the development of those diagrams. But I will say that when you're thinking about bankful, another way to think about this, folks, is picture, we just had a big storm yesterday come through the east side of Atlanta. You get a big gully washer like that, if it's persistent enough and heavy enough, that might be our 1.5 year storm. So try and picture what's going to be going through here during that 1.5 year event. I'm not suggesting you actually would be able to visualize that accurately, but from a conceptual level, try and picture a lot of water flowing through this channel. That's the elevation we're trying to identify. All right, and here is the all-important and difficult to, quite grasp sometimes, definition of bankful. This comes from Dunn and Leopold. These gentlemen are the godfathers, if you will, of the concept of bankful and many other stream geomorphology principles. Nonetheless, I'll read it here. The bankful stage corresponds to the discharge at which channel maintenance is the most effective. That is, the discharge at which moving sediment, forming or removing bars, forming or changing bends and meanders, and generally doing work results in average morphologic characteristics of channels. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, really. I think if you know, look, this is a pretty difficult thing about a pretty dynamic system, and again, the purpose here, everybody, is that if we size our culverts to that bankful width, aquatic passage should be accommodated. Again, reminder, these are embedded culverts, so they should have natural substrate, which will allow for a little bit more sinuosity in there, not just a stock straight barrel. It also, should, if we do have need to accommodate floods or greater flows, we can do that with additional barrels and some other modifications that Sam will discuss. So as I'm trying to present all this information, it applies to the ecologist, it applies to the designer, and at the far end of it, it applies to project delivery. So that's why this difficult to understand concept has become one of the very most impactful concepts to the GDOT program right now in terms of project delivery. Common indicators include shelving, break and slope, rack lines, and as I've mentioned, impaired systems are just hard. If you get a deeply incised system, there may be no bank, or the bank may be so vertical as the stream is down cutting that none of these indicators will remain on the walls of that channel, so to speak. So this is tricky, and those are the cases where, as an ecologist, this is our hard job, everybody. We've got to go and turn gray into black and white. So do what you can, do your best, but also disclose, please disclose if you're uncertain to your designer so that you can talk more about how to arrive at the right measurement. We are not trying to advocate for ecologists to be the last word on how a culvert design is implemented. We are trying to make sure the ecologist has a role, has a voice, and that the designer understands why and what that is. Obviously, the designer's in the driver's seat there. Regional curves. This is a very important resource that Sam will talk more about. But long story short, the regional curves available for our part of the country allow modeling, hydraulic modeling to occur that is informative. And in fact, another way to try and arrive at these Bankful dimensions that isn't real field work, but rather real modeling work. And so hopefully we can compare our field work to models such as regional curves and see that they align. And if they don't, that doesn't mean we can't build the road. That means we have to think more about what the appropriate way is to design the culvert and make sure we're not missing the mark too far in terms of what the genuine Bankful measurements should be. Here's some more Bankful photos. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers provided these. This is again, may not be what you're expecting when you hear the term Bankful. On the left, you can see we've, the Corps has input some dashed lines as an indication of where Bankful would be on this system. And on the right, you can see that Bankful is apparently flagged. Tough Bankful calls, I've talked about these plenty, but here they are. Imagine being an ecologist and somebody says, yeah, just look for the rack line and the benches and so on in this system. Well, this system is getting plowed through by so much water at a time at this moment, and the banks are unstable enough that this thing is changing rapidly. And when that's happening, again, that channel evolution continues. It forms and it reforms and it reforms. So through chaos, order emerges over time, but right now what we're looking at is chaos. So that is a very difficult system to take engineering principles and careful measurements in and say, I, with great confidence, can tell you the exact right width of this system is X. So I'm not trying to diminish the challenge here for the ecologists, but I am saying that we all need to rise to this challenge if we're going to try and reconnect these watersheds that otherwise we as a department risk disconnecting through our activities. All right, so coming from Penn State, they've got a good resource in terms of guidance determining Bankful, and just wanted to share some of what they've put on the street. Bankful flow, the elevation point of incipient flooding, which makes sense to me I'm not qualified to question others' definitions here, but I will say that the point of incipient flooding again can be a little bit misleading because it sounds like top of bank. And again, in Georgia, the majority of streams I've looked at, Bankful is not at the top of bank. Channel forming flow is a much better way to conceive of it because again, this is less about the channel itself and more about the flows that create the channel in a way. Field indicators that are so helpful, including changes within the bank slope, depositional features, changes in particle size, which is where substrate is very important. Obviously, sand sorts out much easier than gravel, much easier than cobble. And so when you get sediment sorting and changes in the sediments within the stream bed, that's an indication of those geomorphology changes, riffles, runs, pools, glides. Those are all based in part on interaction with the substrate. Vegetation changes and scour features are also important. A few helpful tips. Bankful flows will be level across the channel, so make sure your tape is level when measuring widths. Think logically about the 1.5-year recurrence interval. Does it make sense that the points you're measuring as Bankful will see flow every 1.5 years? This is that gut check that, again, it's difficult to. Field science is different than laboratory science, and some of this gut check stuff is really important. And look, y'all, there will be times, and in the last 1.5 years when we've done this, we've had times where ecologists go out, good ecologists get good data and come back and we compare it to the models and we say, hey, we're not sure which one of these is right and wrong. In the end, the photographs and the data collected at the site is hugely important to try and come to a conclusion on what the appropriate Bankful measurements are going to be as we make that all important decision for a culvert that's going to be there for decades. On entrenched streams, bankful elevation is often below the elevation of top of bank due to man-made impacts, and tree roots and other vegetation can exist below bankful, especially in dry years. And so a lot of folks, I guess these are helpful tips from Pennsylvania because these are stumbling blocks for folks in the field. Always be coordinating. When ecologists gather this information, if it's early on in a project, as we want it, as we look forward to in the bright future, we do want ecologists to continue to initiate that collaboration from A3M and continue to, be cognizant of what's going on in a given perennial stream with a culvert over the life of the project. Designer, even more so. We have several touch points. We have the A3M, we have constructability reviews, we have field plan reviews. There are many times built into our plan development process when this collaboration can naturally occur. And when in fact it's already occurring, we need to add this to the list of priorities during those meetings to make sure we're on track. In terms of resource delineations, obviously, the usual exchanges that happen when giving delineations to design, we can include this in that coordination, sharing with them the GPS coordinates and the bankful widths when we give the delineations. Again, if you're not dealing with a brand new project, and so many of us are not, we will talk about ways that we can try and address these permit requirements for projects that are already out of the gate, so to speak. Last bullet here, discuss existing culvert locations with regard to aquatic passage and advocate for replacements if warranted. Ecologist as advocate is kind of, in some ways, it's almost part of our office's identity. We're environmentalists in the Office of Environmental Services, so in that regard, you might consider us advocates. I will say, this is a big tent operation, y'all. We have, and I don't want ecologists to take the impression that advocating for replacements because the ecologist thinks it's warranted, that we sort of die on that hill, so to speak. And there may be occasions when an ecologist feels strongly and does want to force that point. And I don't mean to say that you don't have a voice to do that with. I do want to remind everybody, to try and get the value out of this that's intended, we do need to collaborate. We do need to work as a team. And so, as Alec Baldwin tells us in Glengarry Glen Ross, but slightly differently, always be coordinating. Okay, for ongoing projects, if your existing data is adequate to create a culvert diagram for a new or replacement culvert, then you're good to go, and you probably don't need to go get more data. Now, that might be a long shot, because unless there was a 404 permit digital terrain model created for your project, you may not have all this information, or if you have this information, it may not be at the level of accuracy. You might have a Dave Hedin guess at bankful, and that's not going to be good enough to identify your culvert width, your appropriate culvert width from that. So a second look is often appropriate. And so if you do look at the available data on your project and you don't have all the information, it's good to gather what information exists, understand what you still need to go get in the field, and go out and get it. Not to wait until the last minute, which we have a few times over the last year, gone out after submitting the permit application, and then in responding to questions and comments from the Corps, going out and doing that rework. We do not, the later the worse, the sooner the better, therefore, in terms of trying to get this information. Now, if this information is informative, but isn't, if there's field work coming up for another reason, please try and align it with that field work. We don't want to create a whole bunch of rework out of this, but once we dug into the existing data, we did find that in practice, GDOT didn't have all the data needed to accomplish these to satisfy these permit conditions on a project by project basis, which means that follow-up survey is important when it's necessary. All right, tips for permit application: tell the story. Supplemental PCN question number 7 is your opportunity to do that. So that's where you want to tell the story in terms of connectivity, tell the story in terms of design constraints, etc. Existing and proposed conditions are critical. Unique circumstances are helpful to know, and explanations and justification in instances where we can't meet the conditions. There is an exception within these conditions that says if you can't meet any of these conditions for practical reasons, explain why. That doesn't mean we automatically get a permit. They could challenge us on our reasoning, but it's just that blow-off valve exists very much to address the fact that in some instances, all these conditions may not be met, and we still will need to, continue with the efforts that are GDOT's undertakings. Justifying extensions versus replacements is important. I will say that the Corps has said that they don't intend to require to force GDOT to replace a culvert, which is I think heartening to hear from the GDOT side that we still decide what we're doing with our structures. I will say, the other side of that is we don't want to work in bad faith with the Corps or with the environment, frankly, and not replace a culvert that otherwise needs replacement in order to avoid this work. Please do the right thing. References to culvert diagrams is helpful in these PCN supplemental information, and photos are extremely helpful. Take good photos, get the context, don't just zoom in on the channel, get the broader area. They are very helpful for years to come once you get them. In terms of diagrams, focus on clarity. I'm going to leave it to Sam to really rigorously get into this, but for ecologists, be a good partner to your designer. Help them, give them advice, and understand that for many folks in the department, a lot of this is a new undertaking. So don't be afraid, everybody, to admit you don't know something. We're all learning as we work through this. It's been a very informative 1.5 year undertaking to get to where we are today with all of this. Including a table of contents is helpful. PDF markups are helpful. And just to let you all know, the Corps is really dialed in on bankful width and culvert width. That is the all-important sort of measurement. If there's one thing to take away, that's probably it. Embedded depths are important, but I think that GDOT engineers are already well aware of the need to design an embedded culvert in most cases. And then stream and culvert alignment that includes any cut fill that may be needed to connect the culvert to the channel. That's all important to include as well. All right, here's a few takeaways before I turn it over to Sam. And actually a few takeaways before our break. Sorry, I've blown past 10 o'clock, but we'll wrap it up quickly here, take a break, and then move forward. So work proactively with your project designer and PM during the concept phase and through the permit application phase. As Sam likes to say, begin with the end in mind. Prepare for your field visit, ecologists, by reviewing the available relevant information. Gather accurate data in the field, such as Bankful. While on site, gather photos and take careful notes on substrate and existing connectivity. And then lastly, note that these conditions are relevant to the 404 permit, but they do not, there are other constraints or considerations with regard to culverts and perennial streams coming out of either Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act or the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act under our joint coordination procedures, which Chris Goodson presented about last week. Forthcoming guidance and data sheets will be helpful. We are working to prepare those for GDOT practitioners, so look ahead to that. Finally, just approach this collaborative effort openly, everybody. This is an opportunity for us to make some good decisions, and together I think we can make our best decisions. So I will pause to see if we have any time for questions. Christina, as the moderator, is there maybe one you want to launch out there that might be informative?
Yes, we do have one question, which is a question about bankful versus rested vegetation. It appears they're asking what would be the difference between those two.
Great question. And these are, so in Georgia, rested vegetation is important. That phrase is straight out of the buffer regulations, and in terms of state waters, state water is buffered in the state of Georgia in part if it has rested vegetation, essentially, which is to say that the flow of the channel prevents water from growing or pushes it over where it butts up against it, so to speak. So in terms of rested vegetation, that is often right up against where more frequent flows occur, not the 1.5 year storm, but rather flows that are happening weekly or monthly or so, you know, on some greater frequency level. And so I would venture a guess that unless it's an incised channel where the channel is down cut and the vegetation's at the top, unless it's an incised channel, typically rested vegetation is going to, the point of rested vegetation for your buffer will be well within inside of the bankful width. The bankful width will be beyond that. That would be my answer there, Christina.
Thanks, Dave.
All right. Well, hey everybody. Sorry I talked too long, and I will pause now and let you all take 5 minutes, and we will reconvene at 10:12 when Sam Woods will take over. And thank you for your attention this morning, and enjoy your next 5 minutes.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Sam Woods, and I'm here to talk to you about Perennial Stream Culverts, design and delivery strategies. I work in the Office of Roadway Design as one of 3 assistant roadway design engineers. All right, I'd like to start by talking about the outline, what I plan on speaking with you all about this morning. I've divided it into 2 main categories. First, a brief introduction where I'd like to talk about context of this whole topic and the engineer's mindset, and then go into a little bit more depth about the engineer's responsibilities, really dovetailing with what Dave took us through on the ecology side. So under the broad topic of context and engineer's mindset, I'd like to talk about the overall application and scope of this topic and how it fits into the PDP, the plan development process, and encourage us to take, instead of a complete 180-degree turn, take a complete or at least approximate 90-degree turn in our mindset and our approach to designing culverts on perennial streams. And for engineers' responsibilities, Dave built me up well here to say that I'm going to say begin with the end in mind, which I will. That's to introduce this whole topic, and then we'll walk through the 3 main phases of the plan development process. Starting with concept, talk about environmental coordination, make our way through preliminary design, where we're doing the actual design of the culvert, and end up in final design, where I'm going to talk about what I'm calling documentation and plan production, basically the assembly of those 39 series drawings for the permit application for the perennial stream culvert diagrams. So let's get started, please, with the application scope and PDP. Some of this may seem overly generic and obvious, but I still do want to give a few general reminders, and bear with me if they're overly obvious, but the scope of this topic is specifically for culverts on perennial streams. Now, a perennial stream as a designer is what your ecologist says it is and what the agency concurs with. So we may have a decent idea before the ecologist goes out there, but we don't really know until resource ID phase has been complete. So for culverts on perennial streams, we're dividing them into these two buckets, either new culverts or culvert replacements, where we'll be providing the full-blown 39 series drawings, or existing culvert extensions, where we'll evaluate for aquatic organism passage and document our decisions. So again, to possibly state the obvious, but hopefully put a fine point on this, this does not apply to culverts on other streams, which are not perennial, such as intermittent streams or ephemeral streams. It does not apply to culverts on wetlands. It also does not apply to perennial streams that are being bridged. So again, the green check mark is the focus of all of our presentation this morning. This is a reminder to designers, Dave made this point also, but the focus of our presentation this morning is on newer requirements. This is not to modify or eliminate or reduce any of our current criteria that GDOT has for the design of culverts or other agencies. So the screenshots you're seeing here are from our drainage design manual, which has very clearly defined design criteria for culverts on our highway system. So specifically for perennial stream culverts, these three topics, and you'll hear this over and over again. You heard it through Dave's presentation, you'll hear it through mine: embedment depth, grade, and bankful. These are the new concepts that are coming out of the regional conditions. They do not take away from GDOT's criteria or, for example, FEMA criteria. So to put this in high-level context within the PDP, or thinking through PDP milestones in these three categories: target or primary goals, when are we supposed to have these things done so that we can deliver our program? And for perennial stream culverts, it's really focused on two milestones: the submission of preliminary plans to GDOT offices. At that point, our culvert is designed and technical studies are being kicked off, and it should end at the environmental lockdown plan submittal, where subject matter experts in environmental will be assembling that 404 permit application package. How do we get there? Where does the work get done? Where does it get developed and coordinated? Well, in the environmental resource ID phase and at the A3M. And like everything, we have check milestones like field plan reviews and constructability reviews, where we're just confirming that our design is appropriate, constructible, doesn't have constraints or conflicts that the engineer wasn't aware of originally. This next slide is really just a graphical representation of this same concept, because I like to reinforce it on the PDP Appendix O. So at the top, you're seeing avoidance and minimization beginning at the very beginning of the project, and transitioning into track and document changes. So just to reiterate, our target milestones here are the submission of plans to GDOT offices, specifically in this case, environmental services, and ending with the environmental lockdown plan submission, again, used to develop the permit. So those are bookending our track and document changes. Our work itself should be done before that in these development milestones of resource identification and the A3M. As you can see on top, both of those occur during our avoidance and minimization phase of the PDP. Also representing our check milestones of the field plan reviews. The next slide is just a quick example of what Dave mentioned earlier, the fact that the PDP does already contain guidance on the A3M and does mention these high-level concepts that we're talking about. It occurs after resource identification is complete, and our duty is to avoid and minimize impacts to those ESAs. All right, so let's move on, please, to our change in perspective, this complete 90-degree turn, or something like that. So here's a beautiful snapshot of a GDOT project, and GDOT's mindset, because this is the purpose of our agency, is to be based along the roadway and our other transportation-based assets. Okay, so let me add to this screenshot a few very simplified schematic versions of streams and point out that a different agency, the USACE or Army Corps of Engineers, their perspective is different, to state the obvious. They are concerned about their resources just as GDOT is concerned about our resources. So we've got two agencies working together where our resources overlap, and we're trying to figure out the best way to provide this aquatic organism passage. So let's dig in a little bit more into that high level concept, and let me just identify a few things on this slide. This red would represent a roadway alignment. This orange would represent construction limits, as in cut or fill. Just trying to help things pop a little bit here. The blue would be simplified stream alignments, and the green here would be proposed culverts, again, in a simplified way. You can see our culverts just end at our limits of construction. So let's drive that same GDOT vehicle through our project and notice that by definition of the roadway, we are setting context and convention for how we think through things. This is how engineers design, this is how contractors build. Alignment and profile along a roadway and cross sections perpendicular to it or to some skew. If I show again the different perspective of the Army Corps of Engineers, again, we're rotating roughly 90 degrees, imagining the stream as the resource and the aquatic organism passage. Streams also have alignments and therefore profiles and then cross sections along. So this is the change in mindset I'm mentioning and will be reiterating throughout my presentation. So let me please make 2 points about this, just to put a bow on this one topic. The first is very straightforward and almost not worth mentioning, but it's still important because it can cause some confusion. And the first point is one of convention or standard practice. The text you're looking at here is taken from our draft guidance on putting together these Section 39 plans. It basically just mentions, remember that contexts are different based on your frame of reference, the roadway versus the stream. The second point to me is the more important one to make and the harder one to do. And that is to, yes, convention is one thing, but really the challenge is to have this different approach, modify your mindset and approach to the design and plan production of that culvert as an engineer. All right, so we're going to move on to the next section of the presentation, which is the engineer's responsibilities. Again, to refresh, at the risk of being somewhat repetitive here, let's begin with the end in mind. The end in mind is to design the correct culvert. And what does it mean to be correct culvert on a perennial stream? It means that the culvert embedment is set at 20% of the culvert height. It means that the culvert slope generally mimics the slope of the stream channel. And it means that the culvert width is greater than or equal to the bankful width. And as Dave mentioned, these first 2 items on my list haven't changed much in recent regional conditions. And they're also relatively straightforward, as represented by this delicious piece of cake I'm showing here. Engineers are used to these concepts. They are straightforward, and we in general have this practice down, I would say. The third one, not so much. To say it was, I like how Dave said it was a gray area that we're trying to turn into black and white. The idea of bankful width is not straightforward, and it is also something new. So with that in mind, let's keep going and refresh our memory on 3 major ways that we've identified to collect bankful information on a particular stream. One of them is regional curve equations. Dave mentioned these briefly. I'll go into a little bit more detail momentarily. Dave went into a great amount of detail on the ecologist field measurement, which is an absolutely critical component of this bankful collection. The third method is to do hydraulic modeling, and we'll go into a decent amount of depth on some later slides on this. This is where the engineer will take a certain flow and model it within a stream cross-section from the survey. So before beginning design, it's very helpful for engineers to also read these perennial stream culvert the guidance on perennial stream culvert diagrams. This is what GDOT has written. This is going to give you a lot of great information. Also read the regional conditions on the culverts to help give overall context. And the reason I want to mention this is if you don't read both, it can be not clear exactly which variables to focus on. So you want to recognize as the engineer which of those variables actually directly influence the design of the culvert. And again, here's those 3 magical variables again: embedment, grade, and bankful width. Maybe equally as important, recognize which items are required on diagrams to comply with these conditions, but do not influence the design of the culvert. And Dave mentioned flood-prone areas, easy for me to say, and I'd like to add on bankful cross-sectional area. These are examples of terms that can be confusing, and it would be easy to see how as an engineer you might need to consider these within the design of the culvert. Instead, let the guidance that GDOT has written to in some sense translate the regional conditions. Let this help you out a little bit. For example, For flood-prone area, we just converted it into a very simple equation where once you know the bankful depth, then you can just easily plot that flood-prone area. And similarly for the proposed bankful cross-sectional area. All right, we're moving on now into the concept phase where we're going to talk mostly about environmental coordination. And the designer's part in this general phase is to quickly run these regional curve equations so that the ecologist can have that context in their back pocket as they go out to identify resources. So just some high-level reminders of what's available and what we're doing in the concept phase under this larger umbrella of environmental coordination. We know where the project is, generally and somewhat specifically, because we should have developed an environmental survey boundary within which these resources will be identified. We also should know some information about the existing culverts and streams themselves, either from a site visit, first time out to see the project, coordinating with survey or environmental, or using existing data that's available through USGS maps or some of its applications like StreamStats. So specifically for bankful estimation within this concept phase, what the engineer is going to be helping out with is using these regional curve equations to determine one potential input to the overall determination of bankful width. And here's how that might look in concept. What you're seeing here is a screenshot of the USGS StreamStats application, where I can basically go in there, select my point of interest, and have this program develop a drainage area based on that point of interest. So now what you're seeing here is what this regional curve calculator spreadsheet that we've created does. So first, I'd like to draw your attention, please, to the number of regional curves here, and bring your attention to the fact that they are mostly from surrounding states. There's only one regional curve developed for Georgia at this time. So unless you're in that coastal plain, you'll very likely be figuring out where in our neighboring states' regional curves best fits the similar region and apply that curve to it. So these regional curves, I'm going to just advance one more slide here so I can show you what's going on in the background. The one input is drainage area. And based on that input, behind the scenes, what's happening is it is taking that input and running different equations that were developed through this research, and then giving us back a bunch of outputs. The one that we're most concerned with is bankful width. So I'd also like to draw your attention, please, to the great variability of the bankful widths that are resulting from this one input. And that's a result of the different characteristics of these different regions. So it is important to take time to think through which regional curves are the best for you to use on your project. So that's really it as far as the concept phase goes. We're going to move into preliminary design phase now. And just like so many things on the roadway design end of things, this is really where the pedal hits the metal, where we turn a concept idea into a set of plans, into a project footprint. So this is where we'll be doing the culvert design in earnest. So I'd like to talk about our third method of determining bankful, which is to hydraulically model a cross-section from survey. Talk a little bit about selecting the bankful that will drive the culvert width, and then talk about a high-level process of culvert design with this new mindset. So in preliminary design, what information do we have? Environmental resource ID is now complete. And keep in mind with this new process that not only does we know what our perennial streams are, which we would even before this process, but now we also have this additional information from ecologists, including their field measurements, pictures, narrative, etc., on bankful. We will also have a survey database which is complete. Now, this is a sub-bullet here that we don't spend too much time talking about the presentation, but we do want to introduce this idea. Our new process will eliminate the need for this additional or supplemental field survey collected, what we used to refer to as the 404 survey, where coordination used to be required between between surveyors and ecologists that would involve planting flags in the ground and those surveyors picking up those flags. The process that Dave described in the field and that we're going to continue on describing in my part of the presentation really separates those two, We intend to get a little bit more data on perennial streams in general at the initial survey collection. And that additional data, in conjunction with the focus on Bankful that the ecologist is collecting, we believe that's going to give us just as good of a data set for us to move forward with this culvert design. Also, in preliminary design, we're making decisions on those existing culverts that Dave talked about. Is it the right decision to extend or replace it? And depending on that decision, that will drive where we end up in the design and documentation of those culverts. If it's an extension or replacement, we'll be documenting that decision. And if it's a new culvert, we will be hydraulically modeling Bankful and then proceeding on in final design with the full 39 series drawings. So I want to talk in a little bit more detail about some considerations for existing culverts, whether to extend or replace them, and how they might relate to AOP, or aquatic organism passage. I want to start by talking about a single barrel culvert. So in general, if you've got an existing culvert out there, it has a width and height, it has a cross-sectional area. To state the obvious, this is a constraint on the design of any extension. So in general, we don't have wiggle room with respect to culvert cross-section to improve aquatic organism passage for single barrel existing culverts. Although we do want to keep in mind the fact that if we are extending it, there may be opportunities to improve that AOP through our longitudinal profile. In other words, if the existing tie-in is slightly perched, we may be able to merge those tie-ins through our extension to provide an invert that is not perched. And for this case, because Bankful would not be a driving indicator on that culvert design, because we know what size the culvert already is, there would be no hydraulic modeling required. I want to introduce one additional consideration when it comes to multi-barrel culverts. And for these cases, what we're recommending and what we're asking engineers to do is evaluate the hydraulic capacity of that multi-barrel culvert, basically to see if there's additional capacity. And what I mean by that is additional capacity beyond what's needed to solve other existing design criteria and requirements, such as passing our 50-year flow with certain freeboard below the pavement and things like that. If that extra capacity exists in the existing culvert, we should, as engineers, in coordination with ecologists, we should see if baffling some of the barrels not carrying the main channel flow is something that can be accomplished, still meet our GDOT criteria, and improve the aquatic organism passage of that culvert. And in that case, we then might be interested in the Bankful width and depth, and therefore hydraulic modeling by the engineer. More refreshing here. Our three driving variables: embedment, slope, and width. Again, because Bankful width is the most complicated one, we want to dive into a little bit more of this topic and specifically talk about it with respect to hydraulic modeling as an engineer might perform on the project. So first, I'd like to talk about what's the same. And by this, I mean, what's the same about this overall workflow as a designer would be used to doing now for any sort of hydraulic analysis? Well, what's the same is it's the designer's responsibility to delineate the drainage area and select the appropriate method for determining the flow. So the screenshot you're seeing here is taken from our drainage manual at GDOT that lists our most common hydrologic methods for determining flow. Nothing's changing here. Also, the analysis tools that we're used to using for some of our common other types of analysis can also be used for this hydraulic modeling. This is not an exhaustive list, but things like Flowmaster, Civil Storm, or Hydraulic Toolbox are examples of applications that are basically solving Manning's equation. And those are the tools we would recommend for modeling this idea of Bankful. So that's what's the same. Well, what's new and what's different about hydraulic modeling of Bankful as compared to our typical analysis? Essentially, our focus is switching from the culvert or the roadway cross-section containing the culvert to that of a stream. And specifically what that means is our study area, or our point of interest, as it's sometimes referred to hydraulically, is not the culvert inlet, but it's instead a location along the stream. So I've written stream cross-section here. This should be the representative stream cross-section, or as Dave put it, the typical section of the stream, which is a great way to tie our lingos together. Another change is the Manning's N value, or the coefficient. With this analysis, that coefficient will be representing the stream bed and not the culvert itself. This is a major takeaway of our presentation, is that engineers analyzing culverts are used to doing things like 25, 50, 100-year storms. We are analyzing a very different storm event here, and it's the 1.5-year storm. Recognize that across the state varies a lot when it comes to different hydrologic regions. So conceptually, it makes sense that this value would vary region to region in the state of Georgia. The 1.5 is what we've accepted in coordination with the Corps of Engineers as the best value to use consistently across the state. So this is a main takeaway message here. What I'm showing below here is a very high-level explanation using the three different common methods there, these three rows. And then as we move across the columns, what math we need to do, the data we do that math to, and the result we're looking for. So basically, because these storms the data for these storms aren't generally collected, these storms that I'm referring to being the 1.5-year storm event, we've got to take the next best thing we do have readily available, the nearest by storms. So depending on your method, the 1-year, 2-year, and 5-year storm. And depending on your method, you will be looking for different variables such as intensity and depth. But at the end of the day, in all the methods, what we're looking for here is that 1.5-year flow to help us approximate Bankful. Next few slides just show this same idea graphically, starting with the rational method here. This is something designers are used to doing already, finding their time of concentration and a storm equal to that duration. So here you're seeing we can easily pull data for a 1-year and a 2-year storm, and for the 1.5-year storm to just directly linearly interpolate between those two values. So here's how you would come up with an intensity for a 1.5-year storm using the rational method conceptually. Similarly, on the NRCS method, you would be looking at a depth in inches, and you would be looking at your 24-hour rainfall data, again, looking at between a 1- and 2-year storm, and using that interpolation to come up with something like a 3.5-inch, in this case, depth on that 1.5-year storm interval. For USGS regression equations, it's a bit different. This data ends at the 2-year storm. We do not have it for the 1-year storm typically. So instead of interpolating, we're going to extrapolate here from the 5-year storm, or if you want to think about it as 100% divided by 5, a 20% chance of exceedance within that year. These are two different ways of saying the same concept here. It's just that the axes are labeled as percent chance exceedance. So I just wanted to tie it to the 5-year storm to make it nice and clear. Similarly, for a 2-year storm, 100% divided by 2 is a 50% chance exceedance. So if we connect the dots, so to speak, between those two events, we can extrapolate what a 1.5-year storm would be and pull a flow rate out of that. Okay, so now we have our flow rates, and I just want to show you one example of how we might use these inputs on one of our tools, the hydraulic toolbox, to put our inputs of that flow and channel characteristics, such as the slope Manning's coefficient and stream characteristics, our cross-section, in order to get our main result, which is our Bankful width. So here in this slide, you're seeing that both reported numerically at 12.5 feet and then graphically on this cross-section. So we're recapping a little bit here. We're talking about the different sources of Bankful data. We are considering the ecologist field measurement to be the primary metric, essentially because it's the real world. Even though it's a great concept, this is a subject matter expert in the field taking actual measurements with tools they have available to them. We just got done talking about hydraulic modeling in decent detail, and before that, regional curve equations in even a higher level detail. And these in general need to be considered as additional metrics, not to be discounted, but to be considered in conjunction with the other Bankful collection and to be discussed before selecting the actual value that'll be used to drive that culvert. This is reinforcing the same concept. I like the way Dave said it better. It's a gray concept we're trying to make black and white. It is important to recognize the imprecise nature and the limitations of these methodologies we're proposing. It's more important to not get bogged down in those limitations and in that imprecision. We do have to get to black and white. So a reasoned determination, which is supported by some combination of the methods above for Bankful, is considered to be success. Some additional considerations. Again, this is a main message here that the width of the culvert needs to be greater than or equal to the Bankful width. Just want to remind people that GDOT has a big menu of culvert widths that designers and ecologists through their coordination can talk through what the best configuration of these will be. Essentially even foot increments from 4 to 10 feet in single, double, triple configuration. It gives you a nice menu of things to choose from. Kind of a fine point here, but it's a nice simplification. Based on our conjunction or coordination with the Corps of Engineers, we can simply disregard the width of the interior walls between multi-barrel culverts. So consider the width of a double 7x7, for example, to be 14 feet wide. All right, we're getting into culvert design, and a reminder that we are doing this with our new mindset. So I'm going to start speeding up on this on my slide pace here in an attempt to get done on time. So I'm going to walk you through this. Let's say the project team agrees on a Bankful of 7.5 feet. Well, the culvert width having to be greater than or equal to that, 8 foot is an obvious great place to start with that width. Then we want to store the existing stream horizontal alignment and cut the profile. This is something we're doing already in our current practice with these 39 series. This will give you a great idea about what the average existing stream grade is. And then we want to start designing that culvert. And we don't want to think about it as just a static slice of roadway embankment, just like we'd throw anywhere with ditches, and then we plop the culvert in, we're done. We want to lay out and iterate horizontally and vertically, just like we would with a roadway, and ensure that we're giving proper tie-ins of that culvert with excavation back into the stream. So that's the last bullet point I just mentioned. A good tie-in is one of the critical components of this. That can be done through the culvert itself or through some amount of channel excavation. And just a few more high-level pointers and general context is to sharpen our pencil more than we're used to doing on perennial stream culverts. Look and be familiar with your existing stream contours. This is not easy to do, but if you can, visualize your design in 3D. Consider different horizontal tie-ins. Play with that horizontal alignment of the culvert. Don't think your first alignment has to be what we stick with throughout the process. Would a slight change in that length or skew angle give a better tie-in? Reminder for plan presentation, at this point of the game, getting the design right is what's key. If you've done that, the plan presentation and final design will fall right into place. That being said, there still can be challenges, even reflecting the perfectly designed culvert in plans in a 2D space, which brings us to our last topic here. And again, I've got a lot of screenshots and high-level examples here, so forgive me if I fly through, but that's probably what's going to happen. So documentation and plan production is the final phase. We are approaching the lockdown plan submission, which the environmental specialist will be using to generate our 404 permit application. If we're really getting down to where we deliver our program. So as a reminder, for existing culvert extensions, we're going to be providing a narrative on that decision-making process, primarily provided by the ecologist. The designer's role in this is really nothing extra. We're going to provide a typical plan view 13 series and 22 drainage cross-section view for these culverts. But for new and replacement culverts, we will be providing these perennial stream culvert diagrams, aka the 39 series plans. So a reminder, the whole objective of plan production is to convey our design intent to our audience. In this case, our audience is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Our chief guidance, I've mentioned this over and over again, I'm going to show you some screenshots soon, is this perennial stream culvert diagram guidance, and it's going to be posted on roads in our design and environmental coordination. Here's what this looks like. It looks very much like PPG stuff, because in essence, that's what it is. The audience here is primarily engineers designing these things. And again, but also for ecologists to be coordinating with them while we're generating them. It basically translates the regional conditions into specific engineer, designer, GDOT type instructions. And here's just a few examples of that. For horizontal alignment, talks about the direction of the flow, making sure you have tick marks and things like that. the longitudinal profile of the stream, give some conventions that we'd like to see on those plan sheets, representative cross sections of the existing channel and of the culvert. So these are just examples of that guidance. The guidance I'm showing so far is for reflecting the design intent of that well-designed culvert. The guidance also includes low-hanging fruit. And please don't discount this. These things go a long way in clarity of our permit applications for both GDOT OES and the Corps of Engineers. So just the fact that we have an order of the plan sheets and we're listing what they are and what size the plan sheets need to be and what scale, these things are very important and should not be overlooked. All right, let's remind ourselves. I'd like to show just a few slides on a new approach. Our approach to plan view, longitudinal profile for the stream, and cross sections are generally remaining the same. We are pitching now this revised approach to the proposed longitudinal profile, or LongPro, as you might sometimes see it abbreviated. I'll remind you of my overly simplified schematic here and how really streams and culverts almost never work out like this. And in reality, the streams are meandering through our project site, and it's not so straightforward as that a single cross section can capture this accurately. So rather than just providing a cross section along this green line, what we are instead going to be providing is a proposed combined alignment. So if I flip back and forth between these two slides, you'll see that the purple is the combined. It covers the full length of the culvert and also the extents of the existing stream beyond that. So over the next few slides, I just want to show you what that looks like on real plan sheets. Current practice is to station the existing stream alignment, nothing new here. The current practice for the proposed is to show what roadway engineers would think of as a drainage cross section, okay, which extends in a straight line along the alignment of that culvert. So you can see how that's problematic because it does not follow the stream outside the culvert, and we'll show you some views of the profile shortly. So now we're getting into the new proposal, which is to store a horizontal alignment for the culvert itself. And then so that we can reflect it in a combined alignment, we will need to provide station equalities. And just so you know, we had a lot of discussion with the Corps back and forth on this concept. It does introduce a little bit more of a level of complexity for people who aren't used to doing this, aka the plan reviewers are looking at these plans. But it is a concept that engineers are relatively familiar with for other reasons when putting plans together, tying alignments together. Let's look at the same thing in profile view or LongPro view, if you will, proposed LongPro. I've got an inset here of the plan view so we can refer back to it. But again, the current practice here is to cut along this green dashed line, and that results in existing ground that doesn't quite look like a stream. So our new practice will be instead to convert that into a combined profile following the stream, then the culvert, and then the stream again. So hopefully what you can see if I go back to this slide is that existing ground changes to be more accurately reflecting the stream. You can also see that we're not showing those roadside ditches because at that point, those ditches won't be there. This also flips all the conventions I talked about previously. We are no longer talking about a cross-section station with offsets. We are now talking about an alignment, a combined alignment with station numbers and elevations. And similarly to plan view, we'll also need to tie those alignments together with station equalities. So this really is the major change in the diagrams that we are proposing. The rest of my screenshots here are examples of the much more straightforward diagrams. This is a longitudinal profile of the existing stream channel. You see there's really nothing much to it. It looks like a profile, right? It looks like a roadway profile, except it's for the stream. Talk about cross sections just very briefly, a representative cross section of the stream that Dave mentioned. Also cross sections at the inlet and the outlet of the culvert. I do want to briefly mention that even if you have the perfectly designed culvert, if you look at the bottom left picture here, if you're anything like me with OCD, and I think most designers are, I wish that culvert were shifted over 2 feet to the right. But how can that be? How can it still be that we have the right culvert here? These are discussions that we're having with the Corps, and it's the answer here is this is hard to do, even with a combined alignment. When those alignments combine, if there's a bend in there and you choose to cut your cross section, within a half a foot of two different locations, that can really affect how it's reflected visually. I would encourage everybody to not get too wrapped up in these shortcomings of the 2D design. Remember that, you know, this is a challenge of reflecting a 3D design in 2D space. This is something we've taken the time to explain to the Corps, and we feel like we've made good progress. That leads me to my wrap up and key takeaways here from the engineer's perspective. We need to work proactively with our team, ecologists and project management, all the way from concept to permit application. Beginning with the end in mind, the major takeaways of Bankful, grade, and embedment. Another major takeaway that the 1.5-year storm is the storm to be using in Georgia to approximate Bankful. I want to highlight this change in mindset, again, from designing a roadway cross-section to designing a proposed stream profile. And please ask y'all to sharpen your pencil, get the design right and tight in preliminary design, and that will help us immensely in final design. A reminder that these requirements specifically for perennial stream culverts do not remove or diminish other requirements that GDOT has or other agencies, and to utilize our upcoming guidance as kind of the main tool for generating these. My last one is a bit of a feel-good comment. It's a reminder for designers, especially, to stay positive, proactive, and focused during the ecologist review and comment period of your culvert diagrams. It may seem from your seat that these are being nitpicked to an unreasonable degree. I can assure you that is not the case. Every comment that ecologist is making is based on experience from past discussions we've had on other permit applications, and any one of these suggestions that we can make to improve these diagrams, the benefits are going to be immense during the permit application. All right, we've got just about 2 minutes of wrap up after this question phase, so I think, Christina, we can open it up to questions. I guess let's maybe start if people have questions specifically for me, and if not, we can open it up to broader questions that Dave might be able to answer also.
Okay, yeah, we just have 3 questions total. So first, is there or could there be a map developed for Georgia by an experienced local hydrologist showing the equivalent regional curves to be used for different sections of Georgia to remove the guesswork for less experienced designers?
That's a well-written and lengthy question. I really appreciate it. The short answer is yes. And that is what we intend to do to provide that exact tool. That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
Second, can you talk about how the project team would go through the process of agreeing on a bankful width so that all on the call can understand how that discussion should be handled and how each data source should be weighted, considered during that discussion?
Yeah, this is the million-dollar question. And so it's, excuse me, it's easy for us to sit up here and describe it. When the rubber meets the road on a project, it will be harder. It will essentially be an estimation of confidence in each source of data from the engineers, the regional curves and the hydraulic modeling, and from the ecologist, the field indicators. In the absence of any one confidence in one of those pieces of data vastly outweighing the others, we will be relying most heavily on the ecologist field measurement. And outside of that, it's hard for me to get specific other than to say, well, for regional curves, we don't feel like there is an extremely relevant similar region in Georgia. Or, for example, in the hydraulic modeling, after the engineers run that, those results may be obviously not that valuable. And one example of that is if you're running this hydraulic modeling and it's showing that bankful elevation as above the top of banks, which would then result in something much larger for a bankful width, that's an indicator that we do not want to put as much weight into the hydraulically modeled value there. So that is, if anything, only a slightly more specific answer than our presentation, but those are the types of discussions that we envision happening at the A3M. So to kind of recap that, regional curves to be in the ecologist's back pocket to help frame their context when they're looking at the stream itself. And then after collection of the ecologist Bankful and our survey, the designer can model this hydraulically. And then we're talking about our results and what we think are the shortcomings in that A3M discussion.
Had a couple more questions come in. What do we do if the Bankful event calculations for a size of culvert that causes overtopping of the road? I think the question is if your Bankful calculations indicate that the event would overtop the road.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and it falls under this point that we've been making about the other criteria still remaining. So basically, the width that we're referring to here that needs to match Bankful is for the main, in a multi-barrel situation, is for that main barrel that's carrying the channel flow. So if you can imagine maybe a triple barrel culvert and a Bankful width, let's just say of 8 feet. Okay, so the designer says, I'm going to put an 8-foot culvert in there, and I'm going to try increasing my height, and this height still doesn't get me enough hydraulic capacity for me to meet the criteria that GDOT or maybe other agencies have established. That's when we need to start looking at other combinations of culverts, envisioning multi-barrel culverts with baffles on the barrels not carrying that main channel flow to attempt to achieve both of these variables. And the only other thing that I do maybe want to add on to that is that the regional conditions are written such that we can tell our story. I mean, we heard Dave say this over and over again. This can be part of the story, and it should be part of the story. The hydraulic results as being a constraint where we may not be able to achieve exactly the right width or grade or other variables that would relate to the regional conditions.
Okay, the D48 requires to round up the 20% embedment. Does it still apply to the box culvert? For example, if I have a 10x6 box culvert, do I embed it 2 feet?
That's a great question, and I don't feel like I'm the person to answer that right now, other than to say that we are actively working, and I say we, I mean the department, but chiefly design policy and support, we're working on updating that detail in conjunction with this overall effort. So, so thank you for the question, but I think that's as best as I can say right now.
Lastly, for Sam, still a little confused about the Bankful width and elevation. Do we have to use the number from the hydraulic analysis, or can we use the number found in the field survey?
Well, I think the answer there is they're separate numbers. The number from the field survey, and I think, if I may, I think I see what some of the confusion is, because in the past, our process tied together the topographic survey and the ecologist determination of things like Bankful. Those are now separated by this new process. So the ecologist field measurement, they're going to take a GPS point so we know roughly where it is as the representative cross section. But that measurement of a certain width and depth, those stand alone. And those are what the ecologist is determining from the field. So when it comes to the designer's end, we are separately looking at that same location on our survey, using our topographic survey to cut a cross section of that stream. And then we are, as the engineers, developing that 1.5-year flow and running it through that channel. The result of that analysis is going to be a width, a top width of that water, which is the Bankful width. So really, you're comparing that hydraulically modeled width with the separate width that the ecologist measured in the field, and then talking about it. We're not directly trying to relate them in any sort of, mathematical or other way.
And last question, this more ecology oriented. What's the proper approach when mapped, even named perennial streams are identified in the field flowing through low gradient, often beaver impounded wetlands? Does culvert design need to anticipate stream Bankful and profile in the event of future change to the wetlands/impoundment that would expose the Bankful channel?
Well,
Dave, or I can take a stab at this myself too. I think this is definitely a tricky situation. This might be a scenario where it makes sense to set up a meeting with the Corps to kind of discuss the approach in terms of establishing Bankful and sizing that culvert properly. I have worked on a project where we had a beaver impoundment that was significantly influencing the area around the existing structure that was going to be replaced. And in that case, for that particular project, the ecologists did go quite a distance upstream to kind of evaluate what the Bankful measurement would be for that natural system. So that's definitely a tricky scenario and probably just involves further discussion with the Corps if possible.
That's great. Thank you, Christina. Getting the thumbs up from Dave here. All right. Well, thank you for those questions. A reminder that we will provide answers also in the follow-up to this presentation. If you'll just bear with me to go through some closing slides. A reminder that recent training has been posted for our 2 previous sessions, one on Section 20 plans and construction envelope permitting, and the one on the JCP, Joint Coordination Procedures. To be posted soon is the presentation that we're giving this morning on perennial stream culvert diagrams. Here is our contact information for Dave and me. Thank you for your attention this morning. We really appreciate it, and we welcome any further questions or feedback. A few follow-ups, please request your PDA certificate by Friday, July 30th. That is the day after tomorrow, according to my math. So that's a quick turnaround. Please jump on that. As always, want to thank Brian Stocks from our AV team for being our producer and helping us guide through the logistics of this. And I could really go on for another hour about this, but certainly want to acknowledge in a special way Christina Schmidt from Atkins Ecology, not only for moderating this discussion and answering that last question, but for her brain, her thinking ability, her guidance, and leadership really throughout the last year and a half of GDOT work on this and coordination with the Corps of Engineers. So thanks a million, Christina. And with that, that'll be my closing words. Thank you for attending and have a good day.